In the dark and violent world of the 14th century, the very foundations of society seemed to crumble under the relentless onslaught of war, greed, and chaos. Imagine a time when churches, those sacred places of worship and refuge, were not safe from the hands of marauders. In 1360, Pope Innocent VI wrote a heart-wrenching letter describing how these holy places were being desecrated and looted by ruthless bands of mercenaries known as the Great Companies. These were not ordinary thieves, but organized groups of soldiers who had no respect for the sanctity of God or the laws of man. They invaded churches, stole sacred artifacts, and even spilled blood within the walls of these holy places. The Pope's words echoed the deep despair and fear that gripped the hearts of people who believed they were living in a world gone mad. 14th century was a time of great turmoil, marked by the 100 Years' War between England and France, the Black Death that decimated populations, and the rise of professional armies known as the Great Companies. These companies were not just bands of soldiers. They were entire armies of mercenaries who roamed the countryside, pillaging, raping, and killing at will. They were so powerful and feared that even the Pope, the spiritual leader of Christendom, could do little to stop them. The Pope's letter reflects the deep frustration and helplessness of a world where the moral and religious institutions that were supposed to protect people had been rendered powerless. One of the most striking aspects of this period was the breakdown of the traditional order. The Church, which had long been the moral and spiritual authority in Europe, found itself unable to control the chaos. The Pope himself, in his letter, laments the fact that even those who were supposed to be the guardians of the faith, clergy and knights, were joining the very forces that were destroying society. This was a time when the lines between good and evil, right and wrong, became blurred. The Pope's words, "If God himself were a soldier, he would be a robber," spoken by an English knight named Talbot, capture the deep cynicism and disillusionment of the age. People no longer trusted in the institutions that were supposed to protect them, and the average person felt utterly powerless in the face of such overwhelming violence. The Great Companies were not just a threat to the Church, they were a threat to the entire fabric of society. They were so powerful that even kings and princes found it difficult to control them. The only way to deal with these mercenaries was to pay them to go somewhere else. This was the strategy that was often used, but it only served to fuel their power and greed. The cycle of violence and extortion continued, and the people suffered the most. One of the most infamous leaders of the Great Companies was Sir John Hawkwood, an Englishman who rose to prominence in the 1360. Hawkwood's story is a classic tale of a man who turned his back on his homeland to seek fortune and glory in foreign lands. He was the second son of a minor landowner and a tanner by trade, which meant he had little inheritance and no prospects at home. Like many others in his position, he left England to join the English army in France, where he gained a reputation for bravery and skill in battle. However, it was in the ranks of the Great Companies that Hawkwood truly made his name. By the time he was in his mid-30s, Hawkwood had become a leader in the White Company, a fearsome band of mercenaries known for their white flags and highly polished armor. They were hired by various Italian city-states to fight in their endless wars, and Hawkwood soon became one of the most sought-after military leaders of his time. He was so successful that he eventually commanded a force of 3,500 mounted men and 2,000 foot soldiers. His reputation for ruthlessness and cunning was such that he inspired the saying, "An Italianized Englishman is a devil incarnate." Despite his brutal methods, Hawkwood was a professional soldier who saw war as a business. He fought for the highest bidder, regardless of which side they were on, and he was careful to avoid fighting against his own king, Edward III of England. Hawkwood's story is not just a tale of individual ambition and success. It is also a reflection of the broader, social and economic changes of the 14th century. The rise of professional armies like the Great Companies was a response to the changing nature of warfare. The old feudal system, where knights and lords were bound by loyalty and obligation, was breaking down. In its place, a new system of mercenary armies emerged, where soldiers fought for pay rather than for honor or duty. This shift had far-reaching consequences, as it made war more professional and more brutal, but also more difficult to control. While the Great Companies were wreaking havoc in Italy, the situation in France was equally dire. The French king, Charles V, known as Charles the Wise, faced a formidable challenge in dealing with the mercenaries who had been left behind after the Treaty of Bretigny in 1360. The treaty, which was supposed to end the 100 Years' War, had left France in a weakened state, with large parts of the country still occupied by English forces. The great companies, who had been paid off by the English to leave France, soon returned to pillage and plunder the countryside. Charles V needed a strong military leader to deal with this threat, and he found one in Bertrand du Guesclin. Du Guesclin was a man of humble origins, born to a poor noble family in Brittany. He was described as ugly, short, and heavy, and his parents despised him so much that they often wished he were dead. Despite these disadvantages, du Guesclin grew up to become one of the most brilliant military commanders of his time. He learned to fight in the guerrilla wars of Brittany, where he developed a reputation for cunning and ruthlessness. He was skilled in the use of ambushes, ruses, and guerrilla tactics, and he was as comfortable using deception as he was using his sword. In 1364, du Guesclin led the French to victory in two significant battles. The first was at Cautionary in Normandy, where he defeated the forces of Charles of Navarre, a chronic threat to Paris. The second was at Auray in Brittany, where he fought for the French candidate for the dukedom, Charles of Blois. Although du Guesclin was captured in this battle, he was later ransomed and continued to serve the French crown with distinction. His rise to power was a testament to the changing nature of military leadership in the 14th century, where skill and cunning were often more important than noble birth. The story of the great companies and their leaders is a powerful reminder of the chaos and violence that characterized the 14th century. It was a time when the old order was breaking down, and new forces were emerging to fill the void. The Church, which had long been the moral and spiritual authority, found itself powerless in the face of the mercenary armies. The nobility, which had traditionally provided military leadership, was being replaced by professional soldiers who fought for pay rather than for honor. The average person, caught in the middle, suffered the most, as the world around them seemed to be falling apart. In the end, the great companies were a product of their time, a reflection of the deep social and economic changes that were transforming Europe. They were a symptom of a world in transition, a world where the old certainties were being replaced by new uncertainties. The story of the great companies is a cautionary tale, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there are always those who will rise to power, and that the struggle for control and survival is a constant theme in human history.